I'm Blythe Brianna. Welcome to Party Rockers Tween Scene. Today I will be interviewing Samantha Berg. Mrs. Berg worked as an animal trainer for Seaworld of Florida for 3.5 years. Samantha is now a licensed acupuncturist who owns and operates the Alaska Center for Acupuncture. During her time in Seaworld, she not only witnessed the daily horrors orcas had to suffer, but also the suffering of other marine mammals in captivity.
Thanks for having me here, Blythe. I'm really excited.
Party Rockers recently did an interview with Dr. Ventry, and he discussed the atrocities that the orca have to endure daily. However, it's not just the orca that suffer at SeaWorld. Is it, Mrs. Berg? Other marine mammals suffer too, physically and mentally. Can you give some examples of this?
No, that's true. There's so many other animals that suffer at SeaWorld, and we would actually be here for hours and hours and hours if I really wanted to do justice to that topic. But I think what I'll do is just talk about a few different animals that I personally know about, and then one story that's actually up on a website that I'm part of. So as you were saying, yeah, it's absolutely not just orcas that suffer. One of the animals that a lot of the marine parks say do well and thrive in captivity are the bottlenose dolphins. But in fact, one of the things that bottlenose dolphins have to deal with in a lot of places in captivity is they're often in petting pools. So they're constantly being subject to people trying to touch them. People actually try to stick things in their blowholes. They don't have shelter to get away from people. In some cases, they don't even have shade. They're packed into these very tight pools. It's very stressful. Animals have died actually from ingesting things that have been thrown into the petting pools. People sometimes treat the petting pools like they're a wishing well. So they throw all sorts of things in there, and the dolphins eat them. So it's amazing what you find in the bottom of a petting pool, actually. But one animal that I worked with personally, I want to tell the story about her. Her name is Celeste, and her name was Celeste. And her mom was Shannon, and her father was named Lester. That's how they came up with the name Celeste. And so when I worked at the Whale and Dolphin Stadium in the early 90s, Celeste's mother had already died, and so Celeste was a very subdominant animal, which means that she just was low on the totem pole. Basically, all the other animals were more dominant than she was, and the older females would actually beat her up and kick her around and make her throw up her food. And eventually what happened was it became more reinforcing or positive for Celeste to throw up her food and play with it than it was for her to eat it. So I actually watched this animal who I love dearly, who was very much imprinted on humans and seemed to really want attention from people. So she started throwing up her food all the time, not even when the more dominant females were around. And eventually it just became so reinforcing or positive for her to throw up her food and play with it that she starved to death, despite us trying to tube feed her and despite us trying to do everything that we could to get her to eat and retrain her to eat normally. She actually wasted away to nothing and died. So that was a pretty horrible thing to witness. The other thing that I saw as a trainer at the Whale and Dolphin Stadium was the death of a false killer whale. And I think that you guys know about the Cove. You've seen the movie The Cove. Yes. So you know about the dolphin drives in Taiji. But when I was at SeaWorld in the 90s, I knew nothing about the drive. I didn't know how the animals had gotten to SeaWorld. So there were 4 false killer whales at the Whale and Dolphin Stadium when I started. And one of the whales was named Zori, and she was always very sick. So I asked my colleagues, well, why is this whale so sick all the time? She couldn't perform in shows. And they said in hushed tones, they said, well, she's from Japan. And I didn't even know what that meant. I didn't understand. I thought that maybe the Japanese facilities were more inferior, that the animals weren't, and maybe that's why they got sick. I had no idea that she'd come from this horrible situation where she was driven into this cove and her family members were killed, and then she was plucked out of there and put in a holding facility with animals she probably didn't know, and that's how she eventually ended up in SeaWorld. So Zori was often on antibiotics, she was on antacids, she was very sick all the time, and eventually one day I came into work and one of the senior trainers handed me a clipboard and said, Sam, start taking respirations on Zori. And what that meant was that I needed to just follow her around the pool and count how many times she took a breath every 5 minutes. And her breathing started to get more labored, and she started to got more and more agitated. And then she started swimming very tight circles, and she started beating herself up against the side of the pool. It was very violent. She was thrashing around because, of course, these are mammals, and while they're starting to die, they're struggling for breath. So Zori basically beat herself up against the side of the pool while everybody was standing around watching and couldn't do anything. And finally, she just threw up this huge amount of blood and guts. It was like everything from her insides just came out, and she just sank slowly to the bottom. And then there was this moment of silence, and one of the vets turned to the other. They'd been watching the whole thing, and they said, "Gosh, I thought we were out of the woods with this animal." And that was so horrifying to me because I was an animal science major as an undergrad, and it felt like frontier medicine, like they didn't really know what they were doing, and the vets had actually thought that this animal was going to be okay, and she died right in front of them. So those were two things that I personally witnessed, and then you can also go on our website at Voice of the Orcas. We have a blog, and we had a woman named Cynthia Payne wrote in and spoke about her experiences as an animal care specialist at Seaworld. She also worked in Orlando, and she tells this awful, sad story about a walrus named Gwen, who I actually worked with. And I'll let you guys go and read it, but the gist of the story is that when Gwen was pregnant, for some reason the management at SeaWorld decided that she couldn't be near this older male walrus, that they thought this older male walrus might harm her baby. So she was forced to stay overnight in a dry pool with no access to water, and she ended up getting scrapes from dragging her belly over this over the dry concrete, and ended up dying from an infection and lost her baby as well. So things like that happen all the time, and to say that SeaWorld is actually not the worst place. There are many more horrible places out there. You can go on the internet right now and do a search about what's happening in Marineland, and that is an absolutely tragic situation. That facility is terrible, and you can read stories about sea lions coughing and the lenses coming out of their eyes because their eyes are so burned from the water. So as I said, I can go on and on and on, but absolutely, I mean, captivity is not good for any large marine mammals, and that's the bottom line. We just can't meet their needs there.
I think what people don't understand when visiting these sites is that these mammals, in the wild, live in a social environment much like ours, and rely on their relationship and interaction with their pods. They are ripped from their families and forced to live a life of isolation. It is absolutely devastating. Can you touch more on this?
Sure, and if you've seen the movie Blackfish, you can see where Dr. Lori Marino talks about the part of the brain that killer whales have that humans don't have. It's called the paralimbic cleft. And what that part of the brain is about is basically where the animals have their identity. And killer whales have their identity literally in the pod. Like right now we're having a conversation and it feels like I'm over here and you're over there. We have a sense of separation, that we're individuals. What that part of the brain seems to be indicating is that the killer whales don't really see themselves that way. In fact, part of their identity is within the entire pod. So when you remove an individual from the pod, you're not just hurting that individual, you're hurting the entire pod. When you separate a mom and a baby, you take the baby away from the mom, whether it's a baby and a mom in the wild, or whether it's a baby and a mom where the baby's been born in captivity. You're actually hurting not just the baby, but you're hurting the mom as well, and you're hurting the entire pod. So that's part of the problem with these animals, because they do have such complex social structures. And then in captivity, in a place like SeaWorld, where they're asking these animals to perform, and I should say they're not really asking, they're forcing these animals to perform every day. In some cases, like with dolphins, it could be 7 or 8 times a day, and with the killer whales, maybe 4 or 5 times a day. They're actually moving the animals around they've already created these artificial pods where you have animals that don't necessarily speak the same language or get along with each other particularly well. But then they're also forcing these animals to move around to different pools so they can have particular animals out in the front show pool to get the performance that they want. So they're not even really allowing the animals that are there to work out their social issues. So you get things like what happened back in 1988, where a whale named at SeaWorld of San Diego, where a whale named Candu rammed another whale named Corky, and she hit her with such force that she actually broke her jaw and she bled out. And there's video of this. Unfortunately, you can see it in the movie Blackfish, where this animal actually bled to death in front of an audience. But there are lesser examples of social strife that you also see in the movie, where animals are raking each other. They're constantly trying to establish dominance. Killer whales are a matriarchal society. The older females are the ones that are in charge. Then you get a weird situation like in Laurel Park off the Canary Islands. This is a situation where the oldest animal there and the most dominant animal is a male. And so it's basically like there's a male teenager running the show. So that also creates all sorts of social issues. And in that particular facility, there is an animal who is just getting completely beat up by the other animals. Actually, there's 2 animals that are fairly subdominant. One is an animal named Morgan, who was captured from the wild in Norway a couple of years ago, held at the Dolphinarium Harderwijk, and eventually moved to Laura Park. And she's a wild whale, and she's been put in with all of these animals that have basically been born in captivity and don't speak her language. So she constantly gets beat up and attacked by these animals. It must be kind of like living in an insane asylum for her. And so there are plenty of examples like that where animals just flat out do not get along because of the artificial situation in captivity.
During your time at SeaWorld, did you ever encounter opposition from a SeaWorld's guest? Someone who changed the SeaWorld science?
While I was there, it's been such a long time that I was there, so I don't remember guests particularly asking me or trying to challenge what I was saying. Back then, and even up until about 3 years ago, SeaWorld was considered, the world leader in killer whale science, which now everything I know, of course, that's pretty ridiculous. And I think part of that is because it's such an isolated environment, and the people working at SeaWorld, the management working at SeaWorld, I think they do believe that they know everything about killer whales. And when you start there as a new trainer, you really want to do a good job. You want to get in the water and swim with the animals. So you do what management tells you to do, and you say what management tells you to say. So, and then when we as trainers would present information to the animals from SeaWorld to the public, there weren't really that many opportunities for the public to question what we were saying. At the end of the shows, people would often come up to the side of the pools and ask us questions, and I'd say the most common question I would hear from people might be, well, why are the killer whales' dorsal fins flopped over? Or they would ask something about, how long these animals live in the wild versus in captivity. And so, yes, we would say the party line to people, which again you saw in the movie Blackfish, that the SeaWorld told people that, and they still tell people that killer whales live about 25 to 35 years, and they tell them that they don't know why the dorsal fin is flopped over, and that it's normal for dorsal fins to be flopped over in the wild. And of course, you saw in the movie Blackfish how that is absolutely not true. But I don't think at the time back then, I don't think the public was questioning SeaWorld the way that they are now. So I think many more people, I would actually like to go and be a fly on the wall after some of the shows at the parks and listen to the kinds of questions that people are asking the trainers now that they've seen the movie. But I think the message is getting out there now that SeaWorld has been basically misleading the public for many, many years about the health of their animals and about the truth about what really goes on behind the scenes. So I think that information is getting out. And although you still probably can't get it when you go to the park from the trainers, there's plenty of information on the internet. And of course, you can go to our website, Voice of the Orcas, and you can read more about what the truth about what SeaWorld's saying versus what's really going on.
I don't understand how people can watch TV and see other animals here abused, such as dogs and cats and even elephants, and be in such an uproar. Why do you think that this is not the same when we see marine mammals in captivity?
That